Stop thinking of the U.S. national debt as a mistake. It is not an accident. It is the final doomed outcome of a deal made in a secret meeting more than a century ago. What they did in the shadows that week didn't just create the Federal Reserve, it designed a perfect machine to convert your future taxes into endless interest payments. An engine of infinite debt that will eventually lead to a total economic collapse. You are taught that the Federal Reserve, the Fed, is a stable public institution built to protect the economy. That is the comforting lie. The terrifying truth is that it was a private structure engineered by the most powerful bankers in the world to protect their own fortunes from the crisis cycle. We are going to go back to 1910 to a remote island and expose the cover story that allowed four powerful men to rewrite the rules of money forever, setting America on a path to a fatal debt spiral. The year is 1907, and the world is on fire financially speaking. The United States didn't have a central bank. If you were a bank, you operated on your own, and if things got shaky, you were on your own. This system, or lack thereof, meant the whole country was stuck in a brutal cycle of boom and bust. Every few years, a panic would erupt. People would rush to banks to pull out their cash, creating a classic bank run. The system would collapse, the economy would freeze, and millions of people would lose everything. The government was powerless to stop it. The banks had a problem. Their biggest and most profitable customers, the government and the huge corporations, always needed to borrow massive amounts of money, especially when the government wanted to fund a war or a massive project. But during these panics, the banks would run out of liquid cash. They couldn't lend, and the whole system would seize up. They needed a safety net. They needed an all-powerful, endless source of money that could be turned on during a crisis. But the American people absolutely hated the idea of a central bank. They had already shut down 2 attempts at a central bank in the 1800s because they feared that powerful private interests would use it to control the nation as wealth. The idea of a few elite bankers getting the keys to the money machine was a national nightmare. So the bankers led by the biggest name in finance had to solve 2 problems at once. First, they had to create the money machine they desperately needed, and second, they had to do it without the American people or most of Congress finding out what was really happening. They needed a secret plan, a perfect fatal deception. The savior of 1907, J.P. Morgan's warning. To understand how the conspiracy worked, you have to look at the man who was in charge of solving the last great panic, J.P. Morgan. In October 1907, the Knickerbocker Trust Company in New York failed. People panicked, lines formed outside banks, and the stock market went into a freefall. The government had no power to stop it. The U.S. Treasury Secretary even rushed to New York, but he was useless. The only person who could save the financial system was a private citizen, J.P. Morgan. Morgan was a colossal figure. He was basically the shadow central bank all by himself. During the panic, he personally called all the heads of the major New York banks to his library. He locked the doors and forced them to put up their own money to bail out the failing institutions. He personally decided which banks would be saved and which would be allowed to collapse. He became the de facto, unelected financial dictator of the United States for a week. Morgan and the other big bankers hated this, not because they didn't like the power, but because it was exhausting, risky, and temporary. Morgan, who was an old man at the time, knew that if another panic hit, there was no guarantee he or anyone else could organize another private bailout. The entire financial establishment was staring at a fatal flaw in their system. They needed a permanent, publicly sanctioned, but privately controlled entity that could do what Morgan did, but with the infinite money-printing authority of the government. A stage was set. The panics had created the perfect political environment for a reform. The public was scared and demanding a solution. The bankers, however, knew a real central bank would never pass Congress if the public knew who was designing it. So, in November 1910, a secret journey began. A group of the most powerful men in finance boarded a private train in New Jersey, pulling the window shades down tight. They spoke in hushed tones, using first names only, and told the train crew they were going on a duck hunting trip. Their destination was Jekyll Island, Georgia, a secluded resort island off the coast, owned by a club of millionaires. Who was on that train? Senator Nelson Aldrich. He was the powerful Republican head of the National Monetary Commission. He was the political cover. A. Piatt Andrew, the Assistant Secretary of the Treasury. He was the government's man, providing legitimacy. Frank Vanderlip, the president of National City Bank, now part of Citibank, the biggest bank in the country. Henry P. Davison, a senior partner at J.P. Morgan's firm. He represented the Morgan interests. Charles D. Norton, president of the First National Bank of New York. Benjamin Strong, another J.P. Morgan protege. He would go on to be the first head of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, the most powerful of the Fed banks. Paul Warburg, the most important mind there. He was a partner at Kuhn, Loeb & Co., and a brilliant German-Jewish banker who had studied the European central bank models, especially the German Reichsbank. He was the architect of the final structure. For 9 days, these men, representing about a quarter of the world's total wealth at the time, met in absolute secrecy. They didn't come to debate. They came to design a system that would stabilize the money supply and guarantee a market for government debt forever. The design of deception, Paul Warburg was the architect who showed them how to pull off the deception. The public hated the word bank, so they decided to call it a system, the Federal Reserve System. Instead of one powerful central bank in Washington, D.C., they designed 12 regional Federal Reserve banks. This made it look decentralized and local, like it wasn't a single point of control. It was brilliant political theater. But here is the fatal trick. While the Board of Governors in Washington, D.C. would be appointed by the president, making it seem public, the regional Federal Reserve banks were to be owned by their member banks, the private banks they served. These private member banks would elect the directors of the regional feds, and the most powerful of all the regional banks, the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, was controlled by the biggest Wall Street firms, Morgan's banks. This guaranteed that while the system looked public and democratic, the power to execute monetary policy, the actual day-to-day work of creating money and buying bonds, would remain in the hands of the bankers who designed it. It was a Trojan horse. The real reason this whole machine was built was to eliminate the cap on government borrowing. Before the Fed, the government had to convince private citizens, pension funds, and foreign nations to buy their debt, government bonds. This put a natural limit on how much the government could borrow, because eventually the market would say, no, we won't buy any more debt at this price. The Federal Reserve Act, which was passed by Congress in December 1913, gave the Fed the most important power of all, the ability to buy U.S. government bonds or debt. And here is where the concept of infinite debt is born. The Fed doesn't need to ask for money to buy a bond. When the U.S. government needs $1 trillion for a new spending bill, it issues a Treasury bond and IOU. The Fed can simply say, we'll buy it. It doesn't use tax money or savings. It buys the bond by crediting the government as bank account with money it has created out of thin air using a few keystrokes on a computer. The government gets $1 trillion to spend. The debt goes on the Fed's balance sheet. This changes everything. The government now has a buyer that will never say no. There's always a guaranteed demand for government debt. The political incentive to stop borrowing is gone because the financial constraint has been removed. The debt is no longer limited by how much the public is willing to lend. It's only limited by how much the Fed is willing to print. This mechanism is why the U.S. national debt is now north of $34 trillion. Without the Fed, that scale of borrowing would be impossible. The market would have crashed decades ago. The Jekyll Island meeting, by creating this guaranteed buyer, essentially installed a permanent, fatal engine into the American financial system. Now, let's trace the money flow to see who benefits from this debt engine. The government borrows. The government issues a new bond and gets money from the Fed. The debt pays interest. This bond is a promise to pay interest every year. Who pays that interest? You do. The government uses your tax money to make these interest payments. The interest on the national debt is now over $1 trillion a year. That amount is a huge financial drain, a literal $1 trillion that cannot be used for roads, schools, or healthcare. The interest flows upward. Who collects that interest? The bondholders. While the Fed holds some debt, the rest is held by massive investment funds, pension funds, insurance companies, and foreign banks, the largest financial institutions in the world. The system is a brilliant transfer mechanism. Taxpayers send their money to the government, and the government sends that money to the wealthy institutions that hold the debt. It is an annual, structural transfer of wealth from workers to capital. The bankers who met on Jekyll Island didn't just design a central bank. They designed a perpetual income stream for themselves and their class, a perfect, inescapable debt trap. Every single payment, every single new trillion in debt flows into this system, working exactly as those men intended. The scale of this operation is staggering and requires a deeper look into the historical context and the way this mechanism was implemented. The passing of the Federal Reserve Act in 1913 was a masterstroke of political timing and manipulation. Many in Congress, at the end of a long legislative session, barely understood the technical, dense language of the bill. It was presented as a fix for the panics, a piece of necessary government stability, when in reality, it was the key that unlocked infinite financial leverage for the banking elite. The Federal Reserve's true power, the power to create money out of thin air to buy government debt, is what makes the current national debt total a clear and present crisis. It means that the government never faces the true consequences of its spending because the bill is always paid by money creation, which ultimately leads to a hidden tax on everyone: inflation. When the Fed creates new money to buy debt, it increases the total money supply in the economy. More dollars chasing the same amount of goods means the purchasing power of your existing dollars goes down. The money you have in your bank account, the savings you worked for, is slowly and steadily devalued. This is the ultimate fatal cost of the Jekyll Island system. The bankers created a system where they get paid massive interest, and the average person pays for it through a constant erosion of their wealth. Think about the sheer audacity of this plan. These men, in a secluded spot, knew they were changing the course of history. They knew that a central bank was the key to unlocking unimaginable profit, and they had the technical expertise thanks to Paul, Warburg and the political muscle thanks to Senator Aldrich to make it a reality while making it look like a benevolent government function. The whole story of the Fed, the story you see in textbooks, is a carefully crafted narrative designed to hide the most important element. It was a bank cartel solution to a banking problem disguised as a public service. This machine, once built, has proved impossible to turn off. Once a government realizes it can finance its spending not through painful tax hikes, but through a few phone calls to the central bank, the temptation is simply too great. Every administration, Republican and Democrat, has used this engine to finance wars, bailouts, massive social programs, and tax cuts. They all became addicted to the limitless borrowing the Jekyll Island design provided. They all rely on the Fed to absorb the bonds that no one else would buy. This is why the debt will never be repaid. The system is designed to prevent repayment because the moment the debt is paid off, the money supply shrinks, the economy collapses into a deflationary spiral, and the bankers lose their perpetual income stream. They built a financial world where a continuous debt is not a sign of failure, but a sign that the system is functioning perfectly. And the final realization should be this: that massive number, the $34 trillion, is not just an accounting figure. It is the accumulated evidence of a century of interest payments that flowed from your pocket to the biggest institutions on earth. It is the physical manifestation of the fatal blueprint drawn up in secret by a handful of men who understood that if they couldn't control the government as money, they couldn't control the world's economy, and they found a way to do both. This is the fatal realization. The Federal Reserve is not just a lender of last resort. It is the engine of infinite debt. It guarantees that the debt cycle can never stop. The men on Jekyll Island ensured that default is impossible, not because governments are responsible, But because a default would collapse the entire global system that is now built on the mountain of debt they created, we are living inside a financial structure that requires us to pay interest on a principal that is deliberately impossible to repay. This debt, this crisis, is the system working perfectly, exactly as designed by J.P. Morgan and his secret conspirators. You are trapped. The story of the Federal Reserve is not a story of public service. It is the ultimate story of private power, a secret cabal of bankers who solved their biggest problem, financial panic, by installing a mechanism that solved the government's biggest problem, running out of money. They created a buyer of last resort for government debt, enabling infinite borrowing, an engine of inflation, and a perpetual wealth transfer from the many to the few. The $34 trillion debt is the proof that the plan worked perfectly. If you want to know how to shield your money from this endless debt machine, subscribe now.